Hello friends, how are you? I'm Ari Thurger and today I'm going to talk about talismans in Norse magic and witchcraft. This was a video requested by one of my patrons, Mr. Yang Liu, who does wonderful talismans, very beautiful pieces, and I will leave here and down below in the description his Instagram, so you may watch his works. It's really worth it, they are really splendid first-class quality. Alright, let's make a little introduction first, so you might perceive what's this all about. In archaeology, there are a couple of objects found from pieces of jewelry, pendants, or plates of copper, bronze or iron, all the way to worked pieces of bone and ranging to sticks or crosses of wood with inscriptions on them. So in general, we label talisman any inscribed object carried or worn for magical purposes. But what exactly is a talisman? What makes it different from an amulet or a charm? Aren't these three categories the exact same? The word talisman has its linguistic roots from the Arabic, which is a description for magical stones, rings, or other objects often labeled by the Romans as amuleta. On the other hand, the word charm serves to also describe the exact same type of objects, but can equally be applied to a spoken or chanted spell. Talisman and amulet are actually synonyms, equivalents. A talisman is an amulet and vice versa. Both can be worn or carried for magical purposes. However, in the case of Scandinavian studies, in Old Norse there are three distinct words for talisman, amulet, and talismanic magic, but all seem to fit into the same category of objects. Thein, which indicates a piece of wood or twig turned into a talismanic object. Luthre, which is an object used for talismanic or divinatory purposes. For instance, in Vetensdila saga, Ingimundre sends two men in charmed shapes, hamfarir, with the ability to change their shapes through a charm, an incantation. So he sends these men to look for his Luthre, which was a small image often depicting a deity carried about as a talisman or amulet. So in this sense, a Luthre seems to be the talismanic object a person carries, but not necessarily made of wood and with an inscription, but representing a figure or a concrete tool. Mjolnir, Thor's hammer, can be seen as a Luthre, a talisman of this sort. And then we have the term taufre, which means both talisman and magic in general, referring to talismanic magic. All these three terms refer to the same thing and purpose, only the materials are different, and the images, and quite possibly the inscriptions and how you imbue magic into the object. Taufre is probably closely related to a charm in the sense that it is a talisman, an actual object, which you need to recite an incantation to imbue the object with power. So, in the case of talismans for Northern Europe, mainly concerning pre-Christian Scandinavia and the use of runic inscriptions, we shall label such talismans as taufre, because it seems to be the term concerning all sorts of talismans with runic inscriptions. Talismans are hard to find, mostly because the great majority were made from perishable materials. We have Roman classical accounts of druids collecting plants and pieces of wood in a great ceremony, and the plants and wood were carried as a charm against every kind of evil. A lot of plants and twigs were used as talismans right up to modern times in traditional witchcraft. Not just plants and pieces of wood, but also certain metals completely disappear with time in certain natural environments. For instance, even parts of the root of fern used to be carved in the shape of a crude hand or fist, which was carried as a talisman. It was a common belief, European folk belief, that the seed of flowering fern is one of the most potent talismans. So there were talismans made of wood, leather, horn, feathers, shells, animal tusks, plants and other organic materials that didn't make it to our time. So I think you got the point that many talismans we simply can't find in the archaeological record. But then we have all sorts of talismans made from materials that endure. For instance, the famous Serpent stone talismans from Finland. And since I'm speaking of Finland, here's an interesting talisman. For several centuries, Finnish sorcery was famous and feared in Northern Europe. And many Nordic peoples would travel to northern Finland, the Lapland area, to buy spells and talismans. Finnish wizards used to sell wind to sailors. Usually the wind was knotted into a piece of rope. If the person opened one knot, a soft sailing wind appeared. 2 knots opened at once released a very strong wind blast, and 3 knots at once produced a windstorm. So even a piece of rope could be used as a talisman. But in this particular case, we are closer to what in Old Norse would be called taufer. Imbue an object with magic through incantations. Then we have other examples, also during the Neolithic. Children in proper Neolithic burials often had talismanic items on themselves. The people from the late Latin period were very fond of placing talismanic objects in graves. A glass bead, a piece of amber, or an unusual bronze pendant function as a piece of jewelry and as a talisman. So in conclusion, talismans come in several categories, in several materials. But it's important to remember that many talismans made from materials that endure can also disappear from the archaeological record. In the case of Scandinavia and Runic talismans, rune masters sometimes would destroy the talismanic objects once their work was done or the object served the intended purpose. Also, many talismans were destroyed because of the post-Reformation persecution of rune masters. So these 2 factors also contribute to the disappearance of talismans for Northern Europe. Magical religious jewelry are what we often label as amulets or talismans. Throughout history, it's jewelry that seems to have more to do with magical practices rather than linked to the official religious activity. Amulets or talismans are much more focused in magical practices of folklore, meaning we enter in the realm of outside religion and into sorcery and witchcraft, folk magic. A talisman is a concrete object somehow endowed with the power to ward off malevolent forces or bring to its owner the protection of a specific deity or a supernatural force. Most talismans enter in the category of apotropaic magic, the biggest single category among the magical workings. We are talking about objects whose magical functions are to ward off evil or harm of some kind. And this is very noticeable in Icelandic magical staves, for instance, most of which are precisely to protect against evil magic, supernatural entities such as evil spirits, etc. And such magical signs are often accompanied by a prayer, an incantation, or some sort of ritual to imbue the sign with power, with the purpose for which it was made. So Icelandic magical staves are a good indicator of talismans and charms in Scandinavian history of witchcraft. For instance, during the 12th century in Iceland, there was a vast amount of cat skinning due to the value of the fur itself and to be used as ritual material. Cat fur was highly valued, so it was very expensive, just as the animal itself, while alive, was of great magical value. Its fur also had magical and symbolic properties. Because it was so expensive, this specific type of fur was probably mostly used by powerful people who could afford it, such as sorcerers who used it in their magic, and the nobility who used cat fur as talismans for their patron goddess Freya. Cat skin was used as a canvas for magical signs, often inscribed with virginal menstrual blood. So here's another example of perishable talismans, but we know of their existence through the Icelandic books of spells. During the Viking Age, the most used talisman was probably Thor's hammer, Mjolnir. Thor's hammer is an indicator of Thor's presence. Instead of depicting a figure or the figure of the god, a representation of his hammer is sufficient, which serves as the very representation of a relationship between humans and this deity. Thor's hammer, most like most talismans, is an apotropaic object for protection against all sorts of evils. So these miniatures of the representation of Thor's hammer that were worn about the neck are the only indication from the archaeological record of talismans associated with a specific Norse deity. Thor was probably the most important god of late paganism in Scandinavia, as is suggested not only by the great amount of Mjolnir pendants, talismans, but also a great quantity of Old Norse medieval poems related to this deity. Thor and Freyr. We also have clear indications of talismans with the image of Freyr carved on them. But that doesn't enter in the category of apotropaic magic, but magic related to prosperity. Nonetheless, these are talismans connected to a deity for a specific purpose. These talismans enter in the Old Norse category of Luthra, talismans with the representation of a deity. Now let's enter in the realm of the occult and leave aside a more academic approach to this subject. What we know so far is that talismans or amulets are types of magical spells that are designed to be worn or carried. That's exactly what they are. Magic turned into a physical object to be used and serve a purpose. So it wasn't uncommon to also have such talismans in domestic animals and houses for protection. In Northern Europe, talismans were magical objects with runic inscriptions, or magical signs, or some sort of image. Many of the talismans were accompanied by the speaking of certain words, galdr, magical incantations. In most talismans of Scandinavian history, it seems an incantation or prayer was highly important to, let's say, activate the spell in the object. Most incantations are quite vague, or at least what reached us is extremely cryptic. But there are extended oral incantations, and it's these incantations that are the very essence of the Nordic magic. Galdur is the Icelandic word for magic, which derives from al-galla, to chant. These magical incantations, as they come described in the sagas, were beautiful, harmonious, and pleasing to the ear. There's no way of knowing what type of incantations they were, since a sorcerer would compose his own verses to accompany the carving of a stave. And that's the essence of it, putting one's own thought and purpose into the object. This is what Galdr is all about, to transform the desire and emotion into spoken words, singing incantations, to give life and one's essence to activate the magical properties of the sign carved on the object. The power doesn't reside in the object. The power is in the carved sign, but the magical property of the sign is only activated by applying the human component, the breath, to give our essence to the object. This animistic notion that objects contain or can contain spirit, and therefore they are alive. As I have said in many other videos, the Norse often said that one's breath is one's soul. And in the Norse myths, much like many other mythological pagan accounts from other cultures, and also tribal accounts of the creation of the cosmos, the creation of the world, and life itself always starts with some deity giving its breath to create life, or a deity that is the personification of the wind, the breath of the world, infusing something with its breath and giving life. I'll have a video for you in the near future about animism, and you will better understand this animistic concept of giving life to something through breath, because in the breath the spiritual essence is released, and therefore it can give life to something. And Galdr is just that. Through spoken or singing incantations, we give part of our spiritual essence to something. So we give life to something. We imbue something with consciousness. And this is why incantations are fundamental in the creation of talismans in Scandinavian magical practices. Without the spiritual essence, without the consciousness given to the object, the talisman itself won't work at all. It's the craft of speech that activates the intended effect on a talisman, on an animated object. So what is required when creating a talisman is compliance, the action of complying, to administrate a magical sign with a wish or command. The only purpose of an object is to have a physical surface to apply the magical sign, which in many cases the very natural element that is used also serves as a sort of conductor of magic, which is why certain types of woods and metals are chosen for specific purposes, because they serve as conductors of magic. But this magic is only activated with a specific sign, and the sign itself only serves its purpose if to it it's given the human component, the breath, the intention, the consciousness. A rune master, a Vitki, gives personality to the object itself. The person creates a living nature in it. Maybe you can better understand this from the sagas and poems when to a weapon is given a name. Runes are carved. Through Galdr, the intention is given, the purpose is given to the weapon, and thus it gains a name, it gains personality. The talismanic form becomes linked to the essence of the runic inscription, thus giving life to the object. The object is affected by the magical force. So the creation of a talisman starts with carving the sign into the surface of the chosen object, and then using the created incantational formula to be in contact with the object and the carved sign. But mind that when I say carving, it doesn't necessarily mean literally carving on a surface. As we have seen in Icelandic magical signs, some are referred to as carvings, but it's actually drawn with blood or spittle or some other component. But in most cases, it's actually carving. Of course, some materials were used for carving. In some magical staves, it's clear that to create them, you must use a specific tool made with a specific material, like a copper knife. But when a specific tool isn't mentioned, the carvings were usually made with steel knives or any other sharp objects of steel. These were the common tools to carve magical signs. Iron, which is the main component of steel tools, is widely believed to carry apotropaic powers in folklore. So it's possible that carving with steel was intended to ward off any interference with the spell's purpose from supernatural entities or any sorcerer. So it's not just using steel to carve a sign for apotropaic purposes. The steel here is used as a protective element to protect the work of carving itself. A brass tool would also be used for carvings, but apparently, as it indicates in Icelandic magical grimoires, the use of brass is to carve magical signs for healing purposes. Of course, there are different metals used to carve different magical signs on a surface for different purposes. Even human bones, in some accounts, were used as tools to carve magical signs on specific surfaces. But in general, it was mostly copper, steel and brass tools. And in terms of surfaces to carve a magical sign, it's a long list of materials, and also depending on the purpose, of course. It could range from bone and horn to organic matter, metals, human and animal skin, etc. But wood was always the preferable surface on which to carve magical staves. Mostly oak, beech, ash, spruce, alder, rowan, and so on. The great majority of these woods are not native to Iceland, so Icelandic sorcerers really went far and wide to gather materials. And I've been talking about Icelanders because most of the magical signs and bind runes carved to make a talisman come from Icelandic sources. But of course, not every runic talisman comes from Iceland. We have cases of medals worn as jewelry produced in Northern Europe during the migration period of the Germanic Iron Age that have clear runic inscriptions. Most of them made out of gold and sewn onto clothing, and most likely served as talismans, runic talismans. There are at least 800 of these golden medals from archaeological excavations dating from this period, and more or less close to 130 have runic inscription. These were not carved but rather stamped into the golden discs. The ones without runic inscriptions doesn't mean they are not talismans. As we have seen previously, talismans don't necessarily need to have inscriptions. An image of something already makes the object a talisman, trying to invoke the power of the figure carved in the surface. Like the example I have given you of the image of Freyr in certain talismans for prosperity and wealth. These enter in the category of the Luthor type of talismans. There is also a wondrous variety of very unique objects that are difficult to classify. Many of them are tools and regular everyday objects that have been turned into talismans by carving runic inscriptions on them or images. I would like to give you an example of a very interesting talismanic object from the Viking Age. Take a look at this copper plate found in Kinvi in Öland in Sweden. which dates from the late 11th century. It's composed by 144 staves. It contains at least 6 magical bind rune staves. The first one was lost due to the action of time and the elements. And then a text in runes which says, "Glory to thee, I bear Bofi, help me, who is wiser than thou, and bear all in evil from Bofi. May Thor protect him with that hammer that from the sea came. It flew from evil, wit fares not from Bofi. The gods are under him and over him." This talisman calls for the protective power of Thor and his hammer, Mjolnir, which always returns from evil once it has hit its mark. The gods are under him and over him, which implies the presence of the gods above and below, completely surrounding and protecting the person who is to carry this talisman. So, this is a very good example of a runic talisman of the Viking Age, evoking religious ideas and turning them into an apotropaic object to a specific person. This isn't the case of a Luthre, but a Taufre, talismanic magic, a talisman with carved incantations or purpose, desire and consciousness, and most likely the incantation spoken in the creation of this talisman must have been similar to what was carved. Alright, my dear friends, I hope you have enjoyed this video. And before you go, most of you are always asking me about sources. So by the end of this video, you will have at least 50 academic sources I have used to help me composing this video. Academic sources, so more exoteric explanations you won't find in the end of this video. These exoteric explanations, more turned to the occult, are my interpretations by the study of the academic sources. Also, if you find this video interesting and you would like to share with your friends and have subtitles in your own language, I will leave down below in the description the link so you can go there and by yourself create subtitles in your language. And in advance, thank you for your help. Once again, thank you so much for watching. See you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag.